Hi, welcome to Counterpunch with Trevor Loudon, the show that exposes the ongoing world communist revolution and pushes back. Please subscribe to the show, like and share the show. We need to get the word out as far and wide as we possibly can. Well, today I'm going to talk about New Zealand, but I think what I have to say will be very relevant to my friends in Australia, through the South Pacific, really every Western country, because the same communist scams are being pulled everywhere. Right now we have a big problem in the South Pacific. The Communist Party of China is threatening to invade Taiwan. They've also threatened Japan. They almost have South Korea compromised as part of their empire already. We're in danger of losing South Korea. So you've got a big general freak out in India, Australia, Taiwan, the Philippines. They're all looking at the Communist Party of China and wondering what's going to happen. If Taiwan is invaded, that's going to fill the South Pacific with refugees. It's going to start an arms race or a general surrender, one or the other. We'll see what happens. But right now, Australia, to its credit, has put in an order for 4 nuclear submarines. I wish it was 40, but 4's a start. Now they're going to be patrolling Australia's waters to deter the communist Chinese. And by extension, they will also protect New Zealand to some degree as well, and other countries like Papua New Guinea, etc. Now, our grateful Prime Minister, the Marxist Jacinda Ardern, has said because New Zealand passed anti-nuclear legislation in the 80s, banning nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered vessels from our waters, Australia's new submarines will not be welcome.
Certainly they couldn't come into our internal waters. Our legislation...
They will not be allowed to enter New Zealand waters. Our best friend Australia, our ally in many wars, is now being told the weapons they are using to defend themselves are not welcome in New Zealand waters. So there's a background to this, a deep background. For many years, Australia and New Zealand were allied with the United States in the Australia-New Zealand-United States Military Alliance, known as ANZUS. And it was a very deep alliance. New Zealand and Australia were both very grateful to America for saving them from Japanese invasion during World War II. And it was an alliance designed to stop Soviet expansionism and to keep the peace in the South Pacific, and to a large degree it was pretty successful. That all changed in 1984 when a Labour Party government was elected and the new Prime Minister David Lange banned nuclear warships, nuclear armed ships from New Zealand waters and harbours. Now that was enshrined in law in June 1987 with the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Act. It was a very popular policy with a lot of New Zealanders, not so much at the time, but even a lot of conservative New Zealanders now think it's great that we stood up and, you know, that we opted out of the nuclear arms race, etc. And New Zealand school kids are told that this is one of the great historic moments in New Zealand history when we basically stopped the Americans bringing their warships into our harbours. But I have a very different view of what happened. I'm sure a lot of Kiwis, New Zealanders will initially not believe what I have to say. It runs very counter to the narrative. But I think with a bit of research, they'll find that the story is pretty darn plausible. And I'm saying it now because many of the actors involved, like former Prime Minister Helen Clark, like former trade union boss Ken Douglas, are still alive. And they played a big part of this, and they should be held accountable. They should be asked about this while they can still defend themselves and answer back. I'm sure they'll duck the questions, but at least they should be given the opportunity. In the 1970s and 80s, New Zealand's pro-Soviet Communist Party, the Socialist Unity Party, was extremely powerful in New Zealand. They achieved this by taking over almost all of the New Zealand union movement. They controlled every major union in the country, with 1 or 2 very minor exceptions. SUP comrade Bill Anderson ran the union movement in the major city in New Zealand, Auckland. Ken Douglas ran the movement nationwide from Wellington. He was the president of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions and the leader of the Socialist Unity Party at the same time. All around the country, the Socialist Unity Party controlled unions everywhere. They also made a major effort to infiltrate the New Zealand Labour Party. New Zealand had two main parties at the time. They had the National Party, which was sort of conservative, and the Labour Party, which was sort of socialist, right? So they went for the Labour Party because the Labour Party was deeply affiliated to the unions. The unions had block voting rights in Labour Party conferences. They controlled thousands of votes. You know, the Engineers Union or the Northern Distribution Union, they would actually vote in Labour Party conferences so they could determine who got elected to the Labour Party presidency, the Policy Council, the National Executive, etc. And also had a lot of influence in who became members of Parliament. One stage, former SUP member Bob Harvey, who was the mayor of Waitakere in Auckland, helped elect David Longy. He was a PR man, a public relations man, and he helped to elect David Longy to the leadership of the Labour Party, and David Longy became the Prime Minister. Now, the Labour Party Policy Council at the time included SUP member Rob Campbell and SUP allies like members of Parliament Jim Anderton and Helen Clark. The party's executive was similarly infiltrated. Margaret Wilson, a very close affiliate of the SUP, became the Labour Party president, and in 1987 she took a Labour Party delegation to the Soviet Union, one of the first times that had ever happened. Labour Party Vice President Ruth Dyson was very, very close to SUP leader Ken Douglas and his partner Marilyn Tucker. In Auckland, members of Parliament Jim Anderton, Helen Clark and Marion Street and Matt Rata were very close to the SUP. In Wellington, it was Sonia Davies and Graham Kelly. In Christchurch, it was Ruth Dyson and Larry Sutherland, who I'm told was the MP for Avon, who I'm told was a full card-carrying member of the Socialist Unity Party. Now, the reason that the Soviet controlled, and they were completely controlled by the Soviet Union, the reason the Soviet-controlled SUP wanted to infiltrate the Labour Party was not so much to communise New Zealand. That could come later, many years later. It was to take over the Labour Party's foreign policy apparatus, because New Zealand was regarded as a country that punched above its weight, that had a lot of influence in the world stage, that messages that came from New Zealand would get a lot more traction than if they came directly from the Soviet Union. So if you could take over the Labour Party's foreign policy, the Soviets could then have another voice on the world stage. Now, in 1976, the SUP founded the New Zealand Council for World Peace. That was a local affiliate of the World Peace Council, the major Soviet international front at the time. Because peace is always important to communists, because the peace movement is about disarming the enemies of the communist movement. Peace to the communists is the end of all opposition to communism. So in Auckland, the New Zealand Council for World Peace was run by comrades Bill Anderson and Alan Marston. Ken Douglas and Barney Richards ran it in Wellington. They were helped by former Labour Party Vice President Gerald O'Brien. By the early 1980s, the SUP controlled the New Zealand Union Movement, the New Zealand Peace Movement, and the left wing of the Labour Party. So the SUP controlled the unions, and through that they controlled the Labour Party, and the Soviet Union controlled the SUP. So effectively, the New Zealand Labour Movement and the Peace Movement and the left wing of the Labour Party were run out of Moscow at the time. Now, at the time, the Soviets' big goal was to destroy NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was the alliance of Western European states who basically worked with America to hold the line against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union planned to invade Europe in 1983, we now know, but they were stopped because Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher were just too darn tough, and they knew they might not win.
We both believe in defending our way of life, and we must do that to keep that way of life secure. But our purpose in having military strength is entirely defensive, to defend our way of life.
They were deterred from doing it. But they were running a massive peace operation in Europe. They had Greenham Common in Britain, a big occupation outside a US military base. They had marches through Rome and Paris and Berlin, thousands of people waving banners, peace in Europe, end NATO, get America out of Europe. And of course this is all run from the Soviet Union by the local communist parties in those countries. Because the goal was very simple. If they could disband NATO, there was no opposition to a Soviet invasion of Western Europe and Britain. And that's what they wanted to do, because they knew if they could do that, they could isolate the United States and they would be 80% towards their goal of world domination. Now, in October 1983, 4 SUP comrades from New Zealand were sent to Moscow for training. They were John van der Ven from Wellington, and from Auckland there was James Thompson, Peter Devlin, and Alan Ware. In Moscow, their passports were taken away, so there was no record they were there. That was really more for third world countries, because it was often a death sentence to be found to be training in Moscow. The New Zealanders actually advertised in their paper that they were going to that country. Now, they were given code names, though. They were John van der Ven, he became John Van. James Thompson became Jimmy Brown. Peter Devlin became Peter J. Alan Ware became Alan Wolf. A little touch of Soviet humour there. Now, while they were training in Moscow, here's just a little incident that tells you a little bit about communism. They were joined by Bill Anderson of the Auckland SUP. He was there in Moscow visiting his Soviet masters. And one night, Bill Anderson and John van der Ven went out drinking. Or as Kiwis at the time would have said, they went out on the piss. And they were drinking hard. And Bill Anderson was a major drinker, very big time drinker. And he got drunk. And he lost his shoes. Don't know how, but he lost his shoes, and this was the middle of the Moscow winter. It was freezing. So John van der Ven had to somehow get Bill Anderson back to their headquarters. So they went to the local, the train station, the underground train, and Mr. van der Ven tried to get Bill Anderson on the train. And this little conductress, about 4 foot tall and just as wide, came up blowing her whistle. "You cannot come on this train. You cannot ride on the metro drunk." So this was a dilemma, this guy could get frostbite, he could freeze to death. So van der Ven, he didn't know what to do. He knew that, he just pulled out his party card, his Communist Party card from New Zealand, and he flashed it in front of this woman. He said, "John van der Ven, Communist, Nova Zelandia." And she freaked. She just freaked, because you do not annoy visiting communist dignitaries. So she took every single passenger off that train and put the 2 New Zealand communists on the train and then let them go to where they wanted to go while everybody else froze waiting for the next train. Socialist equality, right? Now, in Moscow, this delegation was training at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. Not a great big secluded property, not far from the airport on the Leningradsky Prospect, but it was all walled in, nobody could see in. It was a big university, and there were about 3,500 students from all over the world training at the time, learning about racial agitation, influencing social democratic parties, espionage, the whole lot. While they were studying there for 3 months, the Soviet instructors told them, these New Zealanders, of a plan that came down from Comrade Andropov, former head of the KGB, former leader of the Soviet Union. The deal was they wanted to destroy NATO, but they were getting opposition from Reagan and Thatcher. But as chess players, so this was the deal, they would have to go elsewhere. They would have to make sacrifices elsewhere. So it was decided that New Zealand would be taken out of the Western Alliance. As the smallest and weakest member of the Western Alliance, and with a very strong communist movement, it was decided that New Zealand was the best candidate. If they could take New Zealand out of the Western Alliance, that would encourage the European peace movement, and New Zealand wouldn't get invaded, so everybody would think, well, that's okay, we can leave the Western Alliance too, we can disband NATO, and when the Soviet tanks started streaming through, it would be too late to do anything about it. Now, we need to understand how sophisticated this place was. There was about a dozen people delegated to a dozen Soviets just delegated to New Zealand alone. There were historians, there were people who'd lived in New Zealand undercover. They knew the sporting culture, the religious culture, the political culture of the nation, the psychology of New Zealanders. They had psychologists, historians, the whole lot. And they worked out a program with these 4 New Zealanders. How are we going to get New Zealand out of ANZUS? And they worked it out because they knew that New Zealand was very grateful to America, liked America. They'd been saved by America in World War II from invasion by the Japanese. So this couldn't be an anti-American program. This couldn't be Yankees go home. This had to be pro-New Zealand. New Zealanders standing up for an independent foreign policy. New Zealanders standing against the nuclear arms race. Kiwis standing up with a backbone and fighting back. This was all patriotic New Zealand stuff, and they knew this would perfectly fit the New Zealand psychology. Now, so these 4, in February, they were there 3 months, they went back to New Zealand. And immediately, they and the rest of the SUP started working diligently to get the Labour Party elected to government in 1984. The SUP also held a whole bunch of secret meetings with the peace movement, the unions, and the left wing of the Labour Party. And these slogans, these were promoted. It was basically, a deal was made that the SUP's anti-nuclear policies would be adopted should the Labour Party come to power later that year. Now, there was actually a deal done. There was actually a sit-down meeting in the Hotel Workers Union rooms in Marion Street in Wellington, where the SUP did a deal with the left wing of the Labour Party. We will get, the communists said, we will use our unions to get you elected if you promise to adopt the anti-nuclear policies. And Labour agreed to that. Now, the Soviets were absolutely overjoyed about this. They couldn't believe how quickly that the Labour Party folded and went along with this. A few months later, there was a snap election. Rob Muldoon went to the polls early, Prime Minister Muldoon, the national leader, because one of his left-wing national members of parliament would not support him standing against Labour's anti-nuclear policies. Her name was Marilyn Waring, and that cut his majority in the parliament down to virtually 0, so he called an early election. And Labour won. They came to power, and Prime Minister David Lange banned nuclear warships. Well, I get a little bit of pushback when I talk about this from New Zealanders, because what do they'll say, particularly the left-wing people, say, well, you can't be right, Loudon, because the new Labour Party, yes, it did adopt the new anti-nuclear policies, which New Zealanders are so proud of, but they also adopted right-wing privatisation, right-wing free market policies. So they couldn't have been under communist direction. It doesn't make any sense. But you need to look at it from the Soviets' perspective. Now, it is true that the New Zealand Labour Party, while adopting the anti-nuclear policies, also slashed taxes. They privatised the railways and many other government services. They cut farm subsidies. They did policies that would normally come from a free market, conservative or libertarian government. And it shocked New Zealanders because it was more or less just done. There was no real consultation about this. It was directed by the Finance Minister, Roger Douglas, and several of his friendly members of Parliament, Labour members of Parliament. And it hurt New Zealand a lot for a start. You know, thousands were laid off. You know, the farmers were ballistic because they were losing their farm subsidies. They drove their tractors up the steps of Parliament. But it was really the working class that really got hit. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. Unemployment went up to like 100,000 people, all because of these free market policies. After 2 or 3 years, the New Zealand economy turned around and things were looking good and employment went down. But for those, especially in that starter period, the New Zealand Labour unions did nothing. They held no strikes. They didn't push back against the Labour Party. Nothing. They did nothing while tens, hundreds of thousands of their own members suffered unemployment, etc. They did nothing. And people couldn't understand this. This is a union movement led by communists. They don't like free market policies. Why are they doing nothing while their people are being thrown out on the streets? Well, it's very, very simple. The Soviet Union didn't care about New Zealand's economic policies. New Zealand could be the last country in the world to go communist for all they cared. All they cared about was the foreign policy. As long as they got the anti-nuclear policies, they didn't care what the the so-called free market faction did. So the New Zealand unions, controlled by the Socialist Unity Party, sold tens of thousands of their own members to unemployment because their Soviet masters cared more about the anti-nuclear policies than they cared about the New Zealand worker. Ken Douglas was a big part of this. He was the leader of the Socialist Unity Party and the union movement, and he kept the unions under control while these free market policies were implemented. Helen Clark, who became Prime Minister, was a big part of this. She was a leader of the left-wing faction in the Labour Party. She pushed for the anti-nuclear policies. She stood back while the free market policies were implemented. She even said publicly one time that she was much more comfortable with Soviet ships in the Pacific than American ones. So she's accountable for what happened here, and she is the mentor of our current Prime Minister, Socialist Jacinda Ardern. So it's no wonder that Ardern is so wedded and so fixed on these policies. New Zealanders were completely manipulated by the Soviet Union, and to this day, most of them are very proud of it. They're very proud that they led the world in this great stand against the nuclear arms race. They have no idea the policies they are so proud of originated from Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in Moscow, and even more with Mr. Andropov, the head of the KGB. Now, the New Zealand's anti-nuclear stand did not lead to a Soviet invasion of New Zealand, as some feared at the time. The Soviets never intended to invade New Zealand. We were far more valuable to them as a free democratic country who could broadcast their propaganda on the world stage than they would have gained by invading us, which they could have done at any time. But the consequences now are very serious, because the Communist Party of China is trying to do what the Communist Party of the Soviet Union failed. They're trying for world domination, and they're trying to take over the South Pacific as part of their plan to isolate America and bring America to its knees. So what you've got now is, under President Trump, he was working with the Indians, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, and the Australians to isolate the Communist Party of China and bring them down. Now that Biden's in the White House, the Chinese have their friend in the White House, and they are very emboldened, and they are going to attack Taiwan almost certainly. They're going to invade parts of the Pacific, and that puts Australia and New Zealand under grave threat. So to save my native country, New Zealand, we've got to get rid of these anti-nuclear policies. We've got to proudly ally ourselves with Australia, with India, with Japan, with Taiwan, any country standing against the Communist Party of China. Because if we do not do that, we will eventually be conquered. We will eventually be compromised. And I don't even think it would take a military conquest. If Taiwan goes, Japan gets neutralized, South Korea gets absorbed by the Chinese empire, if India makes deals with Russia, it'll just be Australia and New Zealand down in the South Pacific. And I think Xi Jinping, the leader of China, would just have to phone up the New Zealand Prime Minister and say, well, we want 500,000 Chinese citizens immigrating to your country this year. We want 3 military bases on your soil. We want to be able to buy every industry in your country that we want to do. We want to run your country. Will you be the puppet Prime Minister? And I think our Prime Minister, whoever it is at the time, Conservative or Labour, will simply say, yes, yes, sir. And that'll be it for freedom in New Zealand. Does anybody think I'm exaggerating on that? Maybe. We'll see. So this is the time to stand up, New Zealanders. This is time to get rid of the anti-nuclear policies, to become proud part of the Western Alliance again, to stand up against the Communist Party of China. This is the mission of our time. If we want our kids to live free in the South Pacific or anywhere in the world, this is the time to stand up against the CCP. So I hope you've found this interesting, if a little disquieting. I hope my New Zealand friends will look at what I've said with an open mind and do their own research. But most of all, I hope they'll stand up with our allies and demand that New Zealand become part of the Western Alliance again. So thanks for watching the show. Please share it. Please pass it around. Thanks so much for caring about your country and your future. So just want to say, God bless my home country of New Zealand, my Australian friends, all my freedom-loving friends all around the Pacific, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.